The glass shattered before I even heard the shot. I was standing 3 feet from Princess Asheril Veolundra when the banquet hall exploded into screams, and my body moved before my mind caught up. I grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her down behind the marble table just as a second bolt of energy scorched the wall where her head had been a heartbeat earlier. Her guards were still turning, still reacting, still too slow. I was faster only because I had nothing to lose, and she had everything. "Stay down," I said, though I doubted my accent made any sense to her in that moment of chaos. She looked at me with wide silver eyes, the kind of eyes that belong to a species built for cold calculation, not fear. But there was fear in them now, raw and unguarded, and for the first time since I had arrived on this world, she looked less like a princess and more like a person. The attack lasted less than a minute. Her personal guard, led by a stern woman named Sereth, finally cornered the shooter near the east corridor and ended the threat before it could do any more damage. When the smoke cleared and the hall grew quiet again, I realized my hands were still gripping the princess's shoulders, and neither of us had let go. "You may release me now," she said, her voice steady again, though her breathing was not. I stepped back immediately. Sorry, habit. Humans have a habit of protecting royalty they barely know. Humans have a habit of protecting anyone who's about to get shot, I said. Royalty just happened to be standing there. A flicker of something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but close enough to notice. My name is Daniel Whitfield, and 3 months earlier I had been assigned as Earth's junior liaison to the Veil Dominion, a sprawling alien empire that controlled more than 40 star systems and looked down on humanity the way an old aristocrat looks down on a new neighbor who just moved in with too much noise and not enough manners. My job was simple on paper: attend functions, smooth over trade disagreements, and make sure Earth's fragile new alliance with the Dominion did not collapse under the weight of a single insult. In practice, my job was mostly to stand quietly in rooms full of people who resented my presence and pretend I did not notice. Princess Asheril was different from the moment I first saw her. She was the only member of the royal court who ever looked directly at me instead of through me. The Veil were a tall, pale-skinned people with fine, silver-threaded hair and eyes that shifted color depending on mood, something I found unsettling until I learned to read it like a second language. Her eyes had been a guarded gray the first time we met, and they had stayed that way through every formal introduction since. Cold, careful, distant. But underneath that distance, I began to notice something else. Whispers followed her everywhere in the palace, spoken behind polished doors and folded hands. The Veil royal line required an heir born of what they called a true bond, a rare biological and neurological connection between two partners that their scientists could measure but never fully explain. Asheril had been promised to 3 different suitors over the years, each one selected by the council for compatibility, each one a spectacular failure. No bond had ever formed, no heir had ever been conceived, and in a culture where a woman's worth was measured against her ability to continue a bloodline, the court had quietly decided what that failure meant. They called her Barren, though never to her face. I heard the word for the first time from a minor court official named Oliver Bates, another human working in the trade office, who mentioned it to me over drinks one evening as though it were common gossip and nothing more. "They say the compatibility tests came back wrong 3 separate times," he told me, swirling his glass. "The council's already looking at her younger cousin as a backup heir. Asheril's basically been written out of her own succession, and she knows it." "That seems cruel," I said. "It's how they think," Oliver replied with a shrug. "To them, biology isn't personal, it's political. If she can't bond, she can't rule. Simple as that." I did not think it was simple at all. I had spent enough time in that palace to understand that Asheril was sharper than every advisor who whispered about her, more patient than every rival who circled her position, and more resilient than anyone gave her credit for. She carried the weight of an empire's judgment on her shoulders every single day, and she never once let it show in public. That kind of strength was not something I associated with weakness or failure. If anything, it made me admire her more. After the assassination attempt, something between us shifted, though neither of us spoke of it directly. She began requesting my presence at smaller gatherings, informal dinners where diplomacy mattered less than conversation. At first, I assumed it was simple curiosity, the same way a person might ask questions about a strange animal they had never seen up close. She asked about Earth, about human customs, about why humans fought so hard for things the Veil considered beneath their dignity, like loyalty freely given instead of loyalty earned through bloodline and duty. "You risked your life for me in that hall," she said one evening, as servants cleared the last of the dessert course from the table between us. "You are not my guard. You are not sworn to protect me. Why did you do it?" "Because it was the right thing to do," I said. "We don't always need a reason beyond that." She studied me for a long moment, her eyes shifting from gray to a pale shade of blue, a color I had not seen on her before. I had started keeping a mental record of those shifts, cataloging them the way a sailor learns to read the changing color of the sea before a storm. "On my world," she said slowly, "everything requires a reason. Every action is calculated. Every relationship is measured for value before it is permitted to exist. I have never known anything else." "That sounds exhausting." "It is," she admitted, and there was something raw in the way she said it, something that told me she had never confessed that particular truth to anyone else in that palace. "Everyone around me calculates my worth by what I have failed to produce. An heir, a bond, a future for the throne. They no longer see me as a person. They see me as an equation that refuses to balance." I did not know what to say to that, not right away. I had spent my whole life being underestimated in smaller ways, passed over for promotions, dismissed in meetings, treated as the least important person in every room simply because humanity was the newest and smallest player among the stars. But what she carried was different. Her failure, real or not, had been placed on her by an entire civilization, and she had no way to argue against it because the very biology of her body had become public record. "For what it's worth," I said, "I don't see an equation. I see someone who's been asked to solve a problem nobody bothered to explain properly." She looked up at me sharply, and for a moment I worried I had spoken out of turn. Then her expression softened, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. "You are an unusual man, Daniel Whitfield." "So, I've been told." Word of our growing friendship spread quickly through the palace, as these things always do. Some officials viewed it as a curiosity, a princess indulging her interest in an exotic ally from a distant, minor species. Others viewed it with open suspicion, wondering aloud what a human diplomat could possibly offer a member of the Veil royal line beyond entertainment. I ignored most of it, though I noticed my supervisor, a cautious woman named Laura Bennett, began pulling me aside more often to remind me that my role was diplomacy, not friendship, and certainly not anything beyond that. "Be careful," she warned me one afternoon, after another one of my private dinners with the princess had become the subject of hallway gossip. "The Veil don't form casual attachments to outsiders. If she's spending this much time with you, there's a reason, and it might not be the reason you think. Maybe she's just tired of being surrounded by people who only see her as a political problem," I said. Laura studied me carefully. "Or maybe you're becoming one too." I did not have an answer for that. Not yet. What I did know was that every time I sat across from a Cheryl, I saw less of the untouchable princess the court had built in their minds, and more of a woman who had spent her entire life being told what she was not, rather than what she could be. She was sharp-witted in ways that caught me off guard, capable of dismantling an argument in seconds, and yet she carried a quiet loneliness that no title could disguise. I found myself looking forward to our conversations more than I wanted to admit, and I began to suspect she felt the same, though neither of us said it aloud. The Dominion scientists had long ago decided that humans were not a compatible species for the bonding trials, not because they had tested us and found us wanting, but because they had never bothered to test us at all. We were too new, too unfamiliar, too far beneath their notice to even be considered a variable worth measuring. It was an assumption built entirely on arrogance, and no one, not even Asheril herself, had ever thought to question it. Until the night everything changed. It began with a simple question, asked quietly over the last candle, burning in her private chamber, long after the palace had gone still around us. "Daniel," she said, her eyes settling into a color I had never seen before, something between silver and gold. "What if the tests were wrong, not because I am incapable, but because they were only ever testing the wrong kind of partner?" I did not fully understand what she meant, not then. But I understood the weight in her voice, the fragile hope hiding beneath careful words, and I understood that whatever she was about to propose would change both of our lives in ways neither of us could yet predict. I just did not know how much. The council chamber went silent the moment Asheril spoke the words aloud. "I wish to request an official bonding trial with the human liaison, Daniel Whitfield." I stood beside her, feeling every set of ancient silver eyes in that room turn toward me at once. Lord Thren, her chief advisor, a thin man with a permanently disapproving expression, rose from his seat so fast his chair nearly toppled behind him. "Your Highness, this is absurd," he said. "The bonding trial exists to secure the future of our bloodline. It has never once been attempted with a species outside the registered compatibility index. Humans were never even entered into consideration." "Then perhaps it is time they were," Asheril replied, her voice calm but unyielding. I had expected resistance. I had not expected the sheer volume of it. Council members spoke over one another, some outraged, some simply confused, a few exchanging glances that told me they were already calculating how this decision might be used against her. Only Surath, standing guard near the door, remained silent, watching the room the way a soldier watches a battlefield before deciding where the real danger lies. "Explain to me," said an older woman near the front, a counselor named Vessa, who I had learned to recognize as one of Asheril's few genuine allies, "why you believe a human, of all possible partners, would succeed where 3 Val suitors of proper lineage have failed." Asheril did not hesitate, because every previous trial measured compatibility using data built entirely around Vale physiology. Human biology has never been included in that data, not because it was tested and rejected, but because it was never tested at all. I am not proposing a solution. I am proposing that we finally ask a question we should have asked years ago. I watched the room shift, slowly, from outright dismissal to something closer to reluctant curiosity. Even Lord Thren, for all his objections, could not argue against the simple logic of her point. The compatibility index had never accounted for humans. It was an oversight built on arrogance, not evidence, and Asheril had just exposed that oversight in front of the entire ruling council. "This trial, if approved, would be unprecedented," Vessa said carefully. "It would also be irreversible in terms of political consequence. If it fails, Your Highness, the council will use it as further proof of your unsuitability for the throne." "And if it succeeds?" Asheril asked. The room fell quiet again, this time for a different reason. No one had an answer prepared for success, because no one had ever believed success was possible. I stepped forward before I fully understood what I was about to say. "With respect, I think you're all missing something. This isn't just a political question, it's a scientific one. If the compatibility index has a gap this large, wouldn't you want to know, regardless of the outcome?" Thren's eyes narrowed at me. "And what stake do you have in this liaison, beyond whatever personal fascination has clearly developed between yourself and the princess?" I felt heat rise in my chest, but I kept my voice level. "My stake is that I've watched a woman get quietly erased from her own future because of a test that was never designed to include her possibilities in the first place. If there's a chance to correct that, I don't see why anyone in this room should be afraid of the answer." Vessa studied me for a long moment before turning back to the council. "The liaison raises a fair point. Whatever the outcome, the knowledge gained would be valuable. I move that we authorize the trial under full scientific observation, with the Dominion's top researchers overseeing every stage." The vote that followed was close, closer than I expected, but it passed. Asheril's request was approved, not because the council believed in her, but because enough of them were curious enough, or cautious enough, to see where the experiment would lead. That night, alone in the private garden behind her chambers, Asheril finally let her composure slip. "You didn't have to defend me in there," she said, staring out at the twin moons rising over the palace spires. "I wasn't defending you," I said. "I was agreeing with you. There's a difference." She turned to look at me, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something unguarded in her expression, something that looked almost like fear, mixed with hope in equal measure. "Do you understand what you are agreeing to, Daniel? If this trial fails, it will not simply confirm what the court already believes about me. It may destroy any remaining credibility you have as well. Humans are already viewed as unproven allies. If this fails publicly, it could damage the relationship between our peoples for years." "I understand the risk," I said. "I still think it's worth it." "Why?" I thought carefully before answering, because I knew this was not a question she was asking lightly. "Because you deserve the truth, whatever it turns out to be. Not a truth built on assumptions nobody ever bothered to test. And because, honestly, I don't think you're the problem here. I think the system built around you never gave you a fair chance to prove otherwise." Her eyes shifted to that pale gold color again, the one I had only seen once before, and this time I understood what it meant. It was not simply hope, it was trust, fragile and newly formed, extended toward someone she had every reason to be cautious of. The following weeks were a blur of preparation. The Dominion's leading researchers, led by a meticulous scientist named Dr. Henry Voss, one of the few humans permitted access to the Vale's most advanced medical facilities, began running an exhaustive series of tests on both of us. Blood samples, neural scans, genetic sequencing, hours of monitored interaction designed to measure everything from heart rate to brainwave synchronization. I had never in my life been examined so thoroughly, and I found myself growing strangely comfortable with the process, if only because it gave me more time near Asheril, watching her navigate the exams with the same quiet determination she brought to everything else. "You handle all of this remarkably well," Voss commented one afternoon, reviewing a set of scans on a wide holographic display. "Most humans find the Vale's medical technology overwhelming. I've had good motivation to adapt quickly," I said, glancing toward the observation window, where Asheril sat undergoing her own set of scans in the next room. Voss followed my gaze and allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "Yes, I imagine you have." Not everyone in the palace shared his quiet approval. Rumors of the trial spread far beyond the council chamber within days, and opinions split sharply along old political lines. Some among the younger nobility found the idea fascinating, even romantic, a princess defying tradition to seek her own answers. Others, particularly those aligned with rival houses hoping to see Asheril's claim to the throne weakened further, viewed the trial as an opportunity in disguise. If it failed, it would only strengthen the argument that she was unfit to rule. If it succeeded, they would need a new strategy entirely, and few of them seemed prepared for that possibility. One evening, as I made my way back to my quarters after another long day of testing, I found Lord Thren waiting for me in the corridor, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "A word, liaison," he said. I stopped, wary but not unwilling to hear him out. "Of course." "I do not trust this trial," he said bluntly. "I do not trust humans, and I certainly do not trust the idea of an heir to the Vale throne carrying blood from a species we barely understand. But I trust Asheril's judgment, even when I disagree with it, because she has never once acted without reason, however unconventional that reason may appear to others." "I appreciate the honesty," I said. "I am not finished," Thren continued. "If this trial succeeds, you will find yourself at the center of a political storm far larger than anything you have experienced in your short time here. There will be those who see an opportunity and those who see a threat, and very few who will simply allow the outcome to exist without attempting to shape it to their advantage. If you care for her as much as your actions suggest, you must be prepared for that storm, not merely for the trial itself. I held his gaze, unwilling to back down from the warning. I understand the risk. Do you? Thren asked, studying me with something that almost resembled respect. I wonder if any of us truly do, until it arrives. He left me standing alone in the corridor, his words settling over me like a weight I had not fully anticipated. I had spent so much energy focused on the trial itself, on the science and the uncertainty of the outcome, that I had not fully considered what success might actually mean beyond the walls of that testing chamber. If the bond formed, if the impossible became possible, the ripple effects would extend far beyond Asheril and me. They would touch two civilizations, two histories, two futures that had never once considered the other as anything more than a distant, uncertain ally. I found Asheril later that night in the same garden where we had spoken before, sitting quietly beneath the twin moons, her expression distant and thoughtful. "Thren spoke with you," she said, without turning to look at me. "I could see it on your face the moment you arrived." "He's not wrong to be concerned," I admitted, sitting beside her on the stone bench. "This is bigger than either of us." "I have known that from the beginning," she said softly. "I have spent my entire life being defined by what my body could not do, by a failure that was never truly mine to own. If this trial succeeds, I will simply exchange one kind of scrutiny for another. If it fails, I will confirm every doubt that has ever been whispered about me." She turned to face me fully, her eyes settling into that pale gold color once more. "And yet, for the first time in years, I find that I am not afraid of the answer. I am only afraid of never knowing it." "Then we find out together," I said, "whatever happens." She reached out and took my hand, something she had never done before, her fingers cool against mine, but steady, deliberate, certain. "Together," she repeated, as though testing the weight of the word for the first time. Neither of us spoke again for a long while, content simply to sit beneath the moons, waiting for the morning that would decide everything. The morning of the trial arrived with a stillness that felt almost unnatural, as though the entire palace was holding its breath along with us. I was led into the bonding chamber before dawn, a circular room deep beneath the palace, lined with smooth silver walls that pulsed faintly with a soft blue light. Dr. Voss walked beside me, reviewing a final checklist on his handheld display, his expression a careful mixture of professional focus and quiet nerves he was trying hard not to show. "The process itself is straightforward," he explained, though I suspected he was repeating it more for his own comfort than mine. "A neural synchronization field will be activated between you and the princess. If a genuine bond exists, the field will detect a resonance pattern between your neural signatures. If no bond exists, the field will simply register no response, and the trial will conclude without incident." "And if something goes wrong?" I asked. "Nothing will go wrong," he said, a little too quickly. "The Veil have performed this trial thousands of times throughout their history. The technology is sound. The only true unknown here is whether human physiology will respond to it at all." That was the unknown that mattered most, and we both knew it. Asheril was already waiting in the chamber when I arrived, dressed not in her usual formal robes, but in a simple pale garment that made her look younger, more vulnerable, more like the person I had come to know in quiet gardens, rather than the composed princess the court expected to see. She offered me a small, steady smile as I approached, though I could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful control she was exerting over her own nerves. "You look terrified," I said, trying to ease the moment with a bit of humor. "I am terrified," she admitted. "I have simply had years of practice hiding it." "Well, you're doing a bad job hiding it from me." That earned a real laugh, brief but genuine, and some of the tension in the room seemed to ease along with it. Around the chamber's perimeter, a dozen researchers and council observers had gathered, including Lord Thren, standing rigid near the far wall, and Vessa, who offered me a small, encouraging nod as I took my position across from Asheril at the center of the room. Laura Bennett stood among the human observers, her expression unreadable, though I noticed she kept glancing toward me with something that looked almost like worry. Voss activated the field with a quiet command, and the silver walls around us began to hum with a low, resonant frequency. A soft blue light rose from the floor, encircling both of us in a gentle glow that felt warm rather than clinical, despite the advanced technology humming beneath it. "Please clasp hands," Voss instructed, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "The field requires direct physical contact to establish an initial connection." I reached out, and Asheril took my hand without hesitation, her grip firm despite the visible tremor I could feel beneath her calm exterior. Her eyes met mine, silver shifting slowly toward that pale gold color, and for a moment the rest of the room seemed to disappear entirely, leaving only the two of us standing in that soft blue light. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "thank you for standing here with me." "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," I said, and I meant it completely. The hum of the chamber grew louder, and I felt a strange warmth spread through my chest, subtle at first, then building steadily until it felt like something was reaching outward from inside me, searching for a connection I did not fully understand. Asheril's grip tightened, her breath catching audibly, and I realized she was feeling it too, whatever this was, this strange pull neither of us had words for. "Resonance detected," Voss called out, his voice suddenly sharp with disbelief. "Neural signatures are synchronizing. This is unprecedented." The blue light around us intensified, rising up in a slow spiral that wrapped around both of us like a living current. I heard gasps from the observers, quiet murmurs rippling through the gathered council members, but I could not look away from Asheril's face, from the wonder and disbelief blooming across her features as the field continued to strengthen between us. "It's working," she whispered, almost too quiet for me to hear. "Daniel, it's actually working." The resonance peaked in a single, overwhelming moment, a wave of warmth and clarity that swept through both of us simultaneously, and then, just as quickly as it had begun, the light softened, settling into a steady, gentle glow that pulsed in perfect rhythm between us, like a heartbeat shared between two bodies. Voss stared at his display in stunned silence for several long seconds before finally speaking. "The bond has fully formed, compatibility confirmed at a level exceeding every previous recorded trial in Vale history." The chamber erupted into noise, some of it disbelief, some of it excitement, some of it something closer to alarm from those who had hoped for a different outcome. Lord Thren stood frozen near the wall, his expression a mixture of shock and something almost like grudging respect. Vessa was smiling openly, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes as she watched the scene unfold before her. Asheril turned to me, her eyes still locked on mine, that pale gold color now steady and unwavering, no longer shifting with uncertainty. "3 suitors," she said softly, disbelief still coloring her voice. "3 suitors of proper lineage, carefully selected by the council, and none of them ever came close to this." "Maybe they were never the right question," I said, echoing the words she had spoken to me weeks earlier. She laughed, a sound full of relief and wonder, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw her fully unguarded, every wall she had built around herself over years of quiet suffering finally allowed to fall away, if only for a moment. The days that followed the trial moved faster than I could fully process. News of the successful bond spread throughout the palace within hours, and from there, out across the wider dominion, carried by messengers and official broadcasts that reached every corner of the empire within a matter of days. What had once been a quiet, painful rumor about a princess unable to secure her own future became something else entirely, a story that captured the attention of an entire civilization. Asheril was no longer whispered about as the Barren princess. She had become something the court had never anticipated, a figure at the center of a discovery that challenged everything the Dominion believed about compatibility, about lineage, about the assumptions they had built their entire society around for generations. Not everyone celebrated the change. Within days, formal objections began arriving from rival houses across the Dominion, questioning the legitimacy of a bond formed with a species outside the traditional compatibility index. Some argued the trial had been improperly conducted. Others argued that even if the bond was genuine, any offspring resulting from it should be barred from succession entirely, regardless of biological validity. Lord Thren, despite his earlier skepticism, found himself in the unusual position of defending the trial's legitimacy against council members who had once stood beside him in doubting it. "You cannot simply dismiss the results because they are inconvenient," I overheard him say during one particularly heated council session, his voice carrying sharply through the chamber doors. "The science is sound, the bond is verified. If this council wishes to reject the outcome, it must do so honestly, on the basis of prejudice, rather than hiding behind manufactured procedural objections." I had not expected him to become one of our staunchest defenders, but in the weeks that followed, Thren proved himself to be exactly that, arguing our case before council members who remained deeply uncomfortable with the implications of what had happened in that bonding chamber. Asheril, for her part, seemed transformed by the outcome, though not in the way I expected. She did not become arrogant or dismissive of the doubts still swirling around her. If anything, she grew more determined, more focused, channeling the same quiet resilience she had always carried into a new purpose entirely. "For years I believed the failure was mine," she told me one evening as we walked together through the palace's outer gardens, the twin moons casting long silver shadows across the stone pathways. "I built my entire understanding of myself around a test that was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. I wonder now how many others have been judged the same way, dismissed by a system that never bothered to ask the right questions." "You're in a position to change that now," I said, "whether the council likes it or not." She glanced at me, a small, thoughtful smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Yes, I suppose I am." We found a strange kind of peace in the weeks following the trial, despite the political storm gathering around us. Dr. Voss continued monitoring the bond's effects with careful precision, documenting changes in both our physiologies that neither of us fully understood, but that both of us could feel, a steady, quiet awareness of one another that seemed to hum beneath the surface of everything we did. "The synchronization appears stable," Voss reported during one of our regular examinations, reviewing a set of scans that displayed patterns neither Asheril nor I could fully interpret. "If this pattern continues to hold, conception becomes not simply possible but highly probable, contrary to every previous assumption made about interspecies compatibility." Asheril reached for my hand as Voss spoke, her grip steady, her eyes settled into that warm gold color that had become as familiar to me now as my own reflection. "Are you ready for what comes next?" she asked quietly, once we were alone again. I thought of Thren's warning in the corridor weeks earlier, of the storm he had promised would follow whatever the outcome of the trial turned out to be. I thought of the rival houses already gathering their objections, of the political weight now resting on both our shoulders, far heavier than either of us had anticipated when this had first begun as a quiet, desperate question asked over a dying candle. "I don't think anyone could ever be fully ready for something like this," I admitted. "But I'm not going anywhere. Whatever comes next, we face it together." She smiled, the same steady, unguarded smile I had come to treasure more than anything else in this strange new life I had found myself living, so far from Earth, so far from everything familiar, and yet somehow more certain of my place than I had ever been before. "Together," she repeated, and this time the word carried no uncertainty at all. Neither of us could have predicted just how quickly that certainty would be tested. The first threat arrived, disguised as a gift. A small carved box appeared in my quarters 3 weeks after the trial, delivered by an unmarked courier who vanished before palace security could question him. Inside, wrapped in fine silk, sat a single dried flower from a plant native to the outer territories, a species Dr. Voss later confirmed was highly toxic to human physiology, capable of causing severe illness through skin contact alone. There was no note, no signature, nothing to identify who had sent it, but the message was clear enough without one. "This was not an accident," Sereth said grimly, examining the box with a gloved hand during the emergency meeting called immediately after its discovery. "Someone within the palace arranged for this delivery. The courier's identity has already been erased from every record we can access." "Which means someone with real influence is behind it," Vesa added, her expression tight with concern. "This is no longer simple political objection. This is a direct threat against the liaison's life." Asheril's eyes had gone a sharp, dangerous shade of red, a color I had not seen from her before, and one I quickly learned to associate with fury, barely held in check. "Find out who sent this," she said, her voice low and controlled in a way that somehow felt more frightening than shouting would have. "I do not care which house is responsible. I want a name." Over the following weeks, the pressure only grew heavier. Formal petitions arrived from 3 separate rival houses, each demanding the council annul the bond entirely, citing everything from procedural irregularities to outright claims that human involvement in Vale succession represented a fundamental threat to the Empire's genetic and cultural integrity. Lord Kalis Dreven, head of one of the oldest and most influential houses in the Dominion, became the loudest voice among them, appearing before the council on multiple occasions to argue that allowing a human-sired heir any claim to the throne would set a dangerous precedent the Empire could never fully recover from. "This is not a matter of prejudice," Dreven declared during one particularly tense session I was permitted to observe from the gallery. "This is a matter of preserving what makes the Vale people who we are. If we allow outside species to alter the fundamental nature of our succession, what remains of our identity in 100 years? In 1,000? I watched Asheril's jaw tighten as she listened, though she remained outwardly composed, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the storm I knew was building beneath the surface. "You speak of identity," she replied, rising slowly from her seat when it was her turn to address the council, as though it has ever been fixed, unchanging, untouched by circumstance. "Our own history tells a different story. The Dominion itself was built from a union of a dozen different peoples who once considered each other unworthy of alliance, let alone bond. Are we now so afraid of growth that we would rather cling to a narrow definition of ourselves than embrace what might actually strengthen us?" Dreven's expression darkened, but he had no immediate answer, and I watched several council members exchange glances that suggested her argument had landed harder than he wanted to admit. That night, as we walked back through the palace corridors together, I noticed Asheril's steps were quicker than usual, her posture rigid with barely contained tension. "You handled that beautifully," I said, trying to offer some reassurance. "I am tired, Daniel," she admitted, her composure finally slipping once we were alone. "I am tired of fighting battles I should never have needed to fight, simply to be recognized as capable of my own future. First I was told I could not bond. Now that I have, I am told the bond itself is unacceptable because of who it formed with." "For what it's worth," I said, "you're not fighting alone anymore." She stopped walking and turned to face me, her eyes softening from that sharp red back toward the warm gold I had grown to associate with her most honest moments. "No," she agreed quietly, "I am not." The threats escalated further in the weeks that followed. Security around both of us tightened significantly, with Serath personally overseeing every aspect of my daily movements through the palace, something I initially resisted before quickly realizing just how serious the danger had become. A second attempt was made on my life during a routine visit to the trade office, an explosive device discovered and disarmed only minutes before I would have entered the building. Investigators traced the device's components back to a supplier with known ties to Dreven's house, though no direct evidence linked him personally to the attack, a frustrating pattern that repeated itself with every subsequent incident. Laura Bennett grew increasingly concerned as the danger mounted, pulling me into her office for a tense conversation I had been half expecting for weeks. "Earth Command is monitoring this situation closely," she said, her expression grave. "There are those back home who believe you should be recalled immediately, before this political conflict escalates into something neither of our peoples can walk back from." "I'm not leaving," I said flatly. Daniel, this isn't simply about your personal feelings anymore, Laura pressed. This has become a matter of interstellar diplomacy. If something happens to you here, it could damage relations between Earth and the Dominion for a generation. Have you considered that? I have considered it every single day, I said. But I've also considered what it means to walk away from someone the moment things become difficult, simply because the political cost feels too high. I won't do that. Not to her, and not to what we've built. Laura studied me for a long moment before finally sighing, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. For what it's worth, for what my opinion counts here, I think you're making the right choice. I just needed to hear you say it clearly, for the record. Asheril, for her part, refused to let the mounting danger diminish her resolve. If anything, the threat seemed to sharpen her, transforming the quiet, careful princess I had first met into something closer to the ruler she was clearly capable of becoming. She began attending council sessions with a new confidence, challenging objections directly rather than allowing others to speak on her behalf, and slowly, gradually, opinion within the palace began to shift in her favor. Vesa proved instrumental in that shift, quietly rallying support among the more moderate council members, framing the situation not as a question of veil purity, as Dravan insisted on calling it, but as a question of whether the Dominion was strong enough to embrace change without fracturing under the pressure of it. You are not merely defending your own position anymore, Vesa told Asheril during a private meeting I was permitted to attend. You have become a symbol, whether you intended it or not. Half the Empire now watches to see whether the Dominion can evolve, or whether it will collapse back into the same fear and prejudice that has limited us for generations. That is a heavy weight to carry, Asheril said quietly. You have carried heavier weights with far less support, Vesa replied gently. You are not alone in this anymore, Your Highness. Remember that. The confirmation came nearly 2 months after the trial, delivered quietly by Dr. Voss during what should have been a routine examination. I watched Asheril's expression shift from careful composure to something raw and overwhelming as Voss reviewed the results of her latest scan, his own professional calm cracking into genuine emotion for the first time since I had known him. The bond has produced exactly what the trial predicted, he said, his voice unsteady. Your Highness, you are with child. The silence that followed felt suspended, endless, as though the entire chamber had stopped breathing along with us. Asheril reached for my hand, her grip trembling now in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and when I looked into her eyes, that pale gold color had never shone brighter. Everything they believed about me, she whispered, tears gathering at the edges of her composed expression, everything they whispered behind closed doors for years, was wrong. It was never you, I said softly, pulling her into an embrace that neither of us had planned, but that felt entirely inevitable. It was never about what you were capable of. It was always about the wrong question, asked by the wrong people, for far too long. News of the confirmed pregnancy spread through the palace and beyond within hours, and this time, the political storm that followed was unlike anything that had come before it. Dravan's objections grew louder, more desperate, as it became clear that the council's moderate faction was now firmly aligned behind Asheril, unwilling to dismiss what had become undeniable proof that the Dominion's understanding of compatibility had been fundamentally, catastrophically incomplete. But louder than the objections, louder than the political maneuvering and the desperate attempts by rival houses to salvage their positions, was the quiet, growing sense throughout the empire that something extraordinary had happened, something that could not simply be argued away or dismissed by council decree. A princess once thought incapable of securing her own future had done exactly that, in a way no one had ever thought possible, and the child she now carried would grow up as living proof that the old assumptions the Dominion had built its entire identity around were never as solid as anyone had believed. I held Asheril close that evening, both of us finally allowing ourselves to feel the full weight of what we had accomplished together, and for the first time since I had arrived on this world, I understood exactly what Thren had meant weeks earlier in that quiet corridor. The storm had indeed arrived. But we were no longer standing in it alone. The final council vote came on a morning heavy with quiet tension, every corridor of the palace filled with a stillness that felt different from the fear of the assassination attempts or the anger of the earlier objections. This was the stillness of anticipation, the entire Dominion waiting to see whether Ashariel's claim to the throne and her child's claim to succession would finally be recognized beyond question. Lord Dravon made one final attempt to sway the council, standing before them with a desperation that had replaced his earlier confidence entirely. "I ask this council to consider the precedent we set today," he said, his voice carrying less conviction than it once had. "Once we open the door to outside bloodlines, we cannot close it again. Our succession, our identity, our very future as a people will never be the same." "You are correct," Vesa replied calmly, rising to address the chamber. "It will never be the same. It will be stronger, more resilient, more capable of surviving whatever challenges the future brings, because we will have proven ourselves willing to grow rather than remain trapped by fears that were never grounded in truth to begin with." The vote, when it finally came, was decisive. The council formally recognized the bond between Ashariel and me, confirmed the legitimacy of our unborn child's claim to succession, and dismissed every remaining objection raised by Dravon and his allies. Thren, standing near the front of the chamber, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile as the final tally was announced, a smile I had never once seen on his careful, guarded face throughout the months I had known him. "It is done," he said quietly, approaching us afterward. "Whatever comes next, Your Highness, you enter it with the full weight of legitimate authority behind you." "Thank you, Thren," Ashariel said, and I noticed genuine warmth in her voice, a far cry from the wary distance that had once defined their relationship. "For your honesty, even when it was inconvenient, especially then." Dravon did not remain in the Dominion's capital much longer after the vote. His influence, already weakened by months of failed objections, collapsed further as moderate council members who had once supported him quietly withdrew their backing, unwilling to remain associated with a cause that had so clearly lost its footing. He retreated to his home territory, and though whispers of continued resentment followed him, the direct threats against us finally began to fade in the weeks that followed the council's decision. The months leading up to the birth passed with a strange, welcome calm after the storm we had weathered together. Ashariel continued her duties within the palace, though Voss insisted on regular examinations to monitor the pregnancy's progress, each visit revealing a child whose development defied every expectation the Dominion scientists had originally predicted, a perfect blend of human and Veil physiology that Voss described, with barely restrained excitement, as unlike anything recorded in either species' medical history. "The neural patterns alone are remarkable," he told us during one visit, reviewing a set of scans that glowed softly on the display before us. "This child will carry capabilities from both lineages, adaptability, resilience, a biological flexibility that neither species possesses fully on its own. Whatever else this pregnancy has proven, it has certainly proven that the old boundaries between our peoples were never as fixed as anyone believed. I found myself growing closer to the palace and its people in ways I never expected when I first arrived as a nervous, overlooked junior liaison. Sereth, once distant and formal, had become something close to a friend, her dry humor emerging more often the longer she spent guarding both Ashariel and me from threats that had, thankfully, grown increasingly rare. Vesa visited often, her warmth and wisdom a steady comfort through the final months of preparation. Even Laura Bennett, once so cautious about my growing involvement with the princess, softened considerably, eventually admitting over a quiet dinner that she had never seen diplomacy accomplish something quite so significant in her entire career. "You didn't just build a bridge between two people," she said, raising her glass in a small, private toast. "You helped build one between two civilizations. I don't think either of us fully appreciated what that would mean when you first arrived here." "Neither did I admitted, thinking back to those early days of quiet dinners and careful conversations, never once imagining they would lead to this. The birth itself arrived on a clear evening, the twin moons rising bright and full over the palace, as Asheril was moved into the medical wing under Voss's careful supervision. I stayed by her side through every hour of it, holding her hand as tightly as she held mine, the bond between us humming steady and reassuring beneath the tension of the moment, a quiet reminder that whatever happened, we were facing it exactly as we had promised each other months earlier. Together. When our daughter finally arrived, her cry echoing through the medical wing with a strength that startled even Voss, I felt something shift inside me that I had no adequate words to describe. She had her mother's silver-threaded hair, delicate and fine, but her eyes, when she finally opened them, were a warm shade of brown, unmistakably human, unlike anything the Vale had ever seen in a royal heir before. "She's perfect," Asheril whispered, exhaustion and joy mingling openly on her face as she held our daughter for the first time. Absolutely perfect. We named her Lyra, a name that belonged fully to neither Earth nor the Dominion, but to something entirely new, something built from the union of two peoples who had once believed themselves too different to ever truly understand one another. News of Lyra's birth spread throughout the Dominion within hours, carried not with the fear and suspicion that had once accompanied every mention of our bond, but with genuine celebration from a population eager to witness the next chapter of a story that had already captured their attention for months. Even those who had once stood firmly with Dravan's faction found themselves quietly reconsidering their positions in the face of such undeniable, joyful proof that everything they had once believed about compatibility and lineage had been built on assumptions never fully tested. Asheril's formal coronation took place 3 months later, in a ceremony unlike any the Dominion had witnessed in generations. She stood before the assembled council, before representatives from every major house across the empire, before delegates from Earth who had traveled across the stars to witness the moment firsthand, and accepted her place as ruler, not as a princess whose worth had once been measured against a flawed test, but as a queen who had proven, beyond any doubt, exactly what she was capable of. I stood beside her throughout the ceremony, not as a diplomat any longer, a role I had formally stepped back from months earlier, but as her chosen bondmate, a position the Dominion had created entirely new terminology to describe, unable to fit our relationship into any existing category their traditions had ever accounted for. "Years from now," Asheril said during her coronation address, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "when historians study this moment, I hope they remember it not simply as the story of a princess once thought incapable of securing her future, but as the moment our people finally understood that our strength has never come from remaining unchanged. It comes from our willingness to grow, to question assumptions we once believed unshakable, and to embrace possibilities we never thought to consider." Thok. The crowd's response was thunderous, a wave of genuine celebration that swept through the palace grounds and out across the capital beyond, a stark contrast to the whispered doubts and quiet cruelty that had once followed Asheril through those same halls. That evening, long after the ceremony had ended and the palace had finally grown quiet again, I found Asheril in the same garden, where we had first spoken honestly with one another so many months earlier, Lyra, asleep peacefully in her arms, beneath the soft glow of the twin moons. "Do you remember what you asked me that first night in this garden?" she said softly, as I settled beside her on the familiar stone bench. "You asked what would happen if the tests were wrong," I said. "Not because you were incapable, but because they were only ever testing the wrong kind of partner." "I did not fully believe it myself when I first said those words," she admitted. "I was searching for hope in a moment when I had very little left. I never imagined it would lead to this." I looked down at Lyra, sleeping peacefully between us, a child who represented everything neither the Vale nor humanity had ever thought possible, proof that the boundaries both species had built around themselves were never as solid as either had once believed. "For what it's worth," I said, echoing words I had spoken to her so long ago, in a moment that now felt like the beginning of an entirely different life. I never saw an equation that refused to balance. I only ever saw someone who deserved a fair chance to prove what she was truly capable of. Cheryl smiled, that warm gold settling permanently into her eyes now, no longer shifting with uncertainty or fear, but steady, unwavering, certain of the future stretching out before all three of us. Together, she said quietly, watching our daughter sleep beneath the light of two distant moons. Together, I agreed, and for the first time since I had left Earth so many months earlier, uncertain and overlooked, I finally understood exactly where I belonged, not simply among the stars, but beside her, in a palace that had once believed her story would end in silence, and had instead become the beginning of something neither of our peoples would ever forget.